Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade.
We chronicled the distinct memories of our childhood in our book, While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s, which takes you on a notably historic journey through that often forgotten decade. We also want to hear about your experiences during the 1950s. We will feature guests whose special stories of that decade will bring to mind magical moments of reflection, some with tears, some with smiles, but above all, a good dose of laughter.
We would like you to chat with us as we bring to mind the sights and sounds so familiar to that time in history. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. If you're new to the 1950s Fun Chat, I'm Janine, and this is my sister Jackie.
Here.
And we are so delighted that you are with us today. I would like to just briefly mention how we get our guests for the Fun Chat, because many of you have asked, well, it comes from either personal friends, friends of those friends, maybe it's friends of those friends of those friends. But then today, our guest is from a unique situation. I had seen a post on Facebook, and he was marching in a July 4th parade and dressed very appropriately for it. I thought, this gentleman has a great story to tell. So lo and behold, he agreed to be our guest, and this will be a fun chat.
Okay, before we begin, viewers, please look at the bottom of the screen, and you will see www. While the Windmill Watched. That is the title of our book, and we would ask that you go to this site for much more information than you're getting right here. And speaking of the book, it's in the upper right-hand corner there. A little windmill silhouette and with a couple of little girls on the front. And you'll also notice a little white dot in the lower bottom. This book was published in April of 2021. The next year, in April 2022, it won the National Independent Press Award in the regional nonfiction category as a distinguished favorite. So on with the show. Enough about that. The guests of the 1950s Fun Chat were either born within the decade or were influenced by that decade. This guest falls into the latter category. Tom Clegg was born in 1961 in Des Moines, Iowa. He was raised in West Des Moines, worked at times on a small farm outside of town, and spent every summer on his grandparents' farm in southern Missouri during most of his youth. He has one older brother. Now, Tom has been married to his wife, Jody, for 36 years. They reside in Des Moines, Iowa, and have 2 married daughters who have given them 4 grandchildren. Tom is a lifelong student of history. And Tom, we welcome you to the 1950s Fun Chat.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Jackie and Janine. It's great to be on your incredible show here, keeping history alive from the 1950s.
Yes, indeed. So we'll begin then and ask you, how did the decade of the 1950s influence your interest in history?
Well, it was, such an influential decade in all of our histories. It is the pivot of the 20th century. Certainly it's at the middle, but you think about it, 1950, the Cold War turns hot in Korea. 1951, along comes color TV, which isn't popular till the 60s, but just the advance in technology. 1952, polio vaccine eradicating a worldwide, pandemic. 53, the execution of the Rosenbergs, and our sense of security gets a little bit rattled. 54, internally, Brown versus the Board of Education. 55, Rosa Parks. You see those cultural changes in our society. 56, Elvis Presley storms the airwaves and music forever is changed. 57, Sputnik, and things are flying overhead that we never thought about before. Marketing in 1958, toys and commercialism aimed at youth. And, in 1958, a little Danish inventor created Legos, which we all know by stepping on in the middle of the night. Our kids.
Yes.
And in 1959, Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution, all that kind of thing. So the decade is bracketed by a known adversary, the communism, and really we ended the decade with a real great sense of unity and security and dominance with a known adversary. And then internally in the 60s, everything sort of unravels permanently. And so such a pivotal time that, and I struggle with any question about like most or how did that one thing, but growing up in the Midwest, and my brother, who you mentioned, he's born in 49. I was born in 61. So we bracketed the 50s. And when you lived in the Midwest, culturally, it's about 5 to 10 years behind the coasts culturally. So while, I Love Lucy and the Honeymooners and Twilight Zone and Leave It to Beaver and, John Wayne and, Jimmy Stewart and Charlton Heston and Marlon Brando and Grace Kelly and Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin and Elizabeth Taylor and Marilyn Monroe.
Whoa, that's way too much.
They took the box office by storm in the 50s. They took reruns by storm in the 60s. So I was kind of a retro 50s kid culturally. I grew up listening to Elvis Presley and Sam Cooke and Chuck Berry and Fats Domino and Buddy Holly and Jerry Lee Lewis and Johnny Cash and the Platters and the Drifters and, that along with the music of the 60s, but that still was topping the charts. And, right here in my state, February 3rd, 1959, the day that music died. Just a few weeks ago, I was on the stage of the Surf Ballroom for another occasion, and we recalled, those influencers, Buddy Holly and Richie Valens and J.P. Richardson, the Big Bopper, got in that airplane and that fateful night. So, I've swam in 50s culture despite having never lived there all of my, so it really impacted my life having not lived then. And my father was a World War II veteran. Mom was a Rosie the Riveter, and then the great boom of the 50s and the abundance. And I'm a baby boomer, so it's my brother. The greatest increase in our population ever. So I can't say that I could be a student of practically anything, much less history, without acknowledging the deep influence of the 50s on the fabric of who I am as a person and the paradigm through which I see the world that we all live in.
And it just, Tom, it just didn't affect the fabric of who you are as a person, but it affected the fabric of the country.
Oh, yes.
And of anyone who lived at that time. I think a lot of it had to do with, especially those of us in rural America, the great changes and for the better lifestyle and better living than what we had before. Not only for those in an urban setting, but in a rural setting too.
Sure. And all the advances in technology and all of the modern conveniences that would allow us to live a life of ease and leisure just made things a little bit more complex. And,
right.
Well, so, if you could choose all those different years that you highlighted and in your intro, if there was one that affected you the most, in one year, what do you think that was?
Well, it affected me or affected us. I think as a culture in the whole world, we can't look away from the Korean War being sort of the dominant event of the 1950s. And a person who I think whose actions was most consequential to us was that most underrated president to occupy the office in the last 150 years, the haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, Harry S. Truman, the last man to occupy the office who did not have a college degree. But what he had was a great deal of leadership experience, and he was a very good poker player, which comes in a moment. And it was his decision. Of course, he's remembered by the world as the man who dropped the atom bomb in the 40s. 1940s, yeah. And he's been lionized and cyanized both for that decision. But a lot of people don't understand or remember that the Pacific theater of World War II was a religious war. The the Japanese people, Imperial Japanese forces, believed in Shintoism, which their doctrine said that the islands, the 7 islands of Japan, the soil itself was sacred. It was divine. It would be to Christian people, the only thing that would compare would be comparing the soil of Japan to the body of Christ in terms of reverence and devotion, and how sacrilegious it would be to defile that. Iwo Jima was a forecast of, it was a closer island, but the first islands where warfare took place was Okinawa. My father fought there. It was the most savage small arms engagement of the war. The casualty rates, it was, dozens of men for just feet of ground, taken, and the Japanese refused to surrender. That the forecast, once that battle was over, the forecast of the cost of invading Japan would be so high that if there was anything in our disposal to bring that to a quick end, and they were forecasting more than 1 million Japanese casualties and 250,000 American casualties.
My.
He decided to drop that bomb because atom bombs don't just destroy cities; they destroy ideas and break paradigms, and that's what happened. It broke the will of the persons who saw their emperor as God himself, and they surrendered. Now, I've been to Japan many times. I have Japanese friends. I love Japanese people. I'm not being racist in any way about this, but just by example, that's what happened in the 40s. Now come the 50s, and the Cold War flashes into heat, and there we are in Korea, and it goes very poorly from June of 1950 to the end of the year, and the American forces suffer defeat after defeat after defeat, have made the longest retreat in our entire military history, down to the little corner of the country in Busan, when all of Truman's advisors were screaming at him to use the bomb. Now, in 1945, his advisors were saying, Harry, you better not do that. Now here in 1950, they're screaming for it. And the man and the office of the presidency was a little bit different than it is now. The entire decision fell on him alone. Him alone. Didn't need approval of the Joint Chiefs or anything. Him alone. So he is, at that time, the singular most powerful individual on the planet Earth. And he said no. But he also put bomber planes in Britain and bomber planes up in Japan and in Alaska to let the Russians and the Chinese know. Might. He didn't tell them no, but he told his own people no. And he learned, that poker player learned the power of a bluff. And he changed the most powerful force that we have, this horrible, nuclear device, from a weapon of destruction to a weapon of deterrence. And he demonstrated, true meekness. Meekness is not weakness. Meekness is strength controlled. Right? That I'll be your friend, but no, I can destroy you. And he with that sheer force of will, and it resulted in him, of course, firing the most popular general we'd had in such a long time, Douglas MacArthur, for insubordination, because he was even working out how he could deploy the atom bomb without the president's approval. So this courage to say no, to you've never led until you've had to fire somebody you like. Then he hired General Ridgway, and the thing went different, but that. And he leaves office, right, in just a few years, 1952. The only man with a lower approval rating having left office was Richard Nixon. He leaves office about 24%. But today, when you ask scholars and presidential historians to rate the presidents, he consistently is in the top 5 of our entire history. So he's in there with Lincoln and Washington and so forth, and Roosevelt. That, if there's something, plus he was the first head of state just 11 minutes after the announcement to recognize the state of Israel when the whole world had turned against him. he was able to risk everything to do the right thing.
Yes. Yes.
This
And I think sometimes
from the Midwest, I think I'm sorry, go right ahead.
I think sometimes, at least for me, the Korean War is underrated in my mind.
Oh, it is.
Maybe it's because I was too young in the 50s to even understand what was happening. But I always heard about World War II and the atomic bomb. And my uncle was in the service. And my mom and dad had friends who were involved in the war. And then when we got to the 60s, I guess by then, when I was 10 years old, and because we had duck our bodies under our school desks, that to try and protect ourselves from the atom bomb, that then a war became more influential in my life. So I really appreciate your information, Tom.
Well, and yes, I remember duck and cover drill under the desks and going to the civil defense or, the bomb shelter and those kind of things because of that reality. But I think his example prevented, because he knew if he deployed that war, it was going to be war with China and or Russia, and it'd be World War III, and it'd be a war unlike other wars.
Yes.
And, in conversation, it's not written down, but in conversation, Albert Einstein said to President Roosevelt when explaining the bomb, that he had no idea what the weapons of World War III would be like, but he could predict the weapons of World War IV would be sticks and rocks, because we would have been utterly destroyed.
Yes.
As a race, as a human race. Yeah.
Well, going on from there, let's move forward in the 50s. Okay, sure. You talked about color TV. Tell us about that, because we only remember black and white in the 50s.
Right. Well, sure. But, it was invented in 1951. Well, for that matter, television was invented, in the Hoover administration, but only, there was no broadcasting companies. And so the technology came ahead, and it was driven, by the way, by military science and that kind of thing. So I picked that out in 1951 just to show the advances in technology that then so influenced the rest of our life. Like you said, you only remember, color TV. And we got ours in 6th grade. I remember that. I think I was 11 years old.
Was that your television or your color TV?
Color TV. Yeah, we had a black and white TV in the basement up till then.
Yeah.
Yes.
But for that matter, 1954 is a demarcation in a lot of things. 1954 is when more Americans had televisions in their homes than didn't. It's also ironic. It's the last year that more Americans attended church on Sunday than did not. Now, I'm not saying that one caused the other, but there's a real change in the fabric of society.
It's amazing that 1 year can define that.
Yeah. And right. And it's not until 1964 that more Americans' homes had air conditioning than did not.
I can believe it.
Yeah. Yes. I am grateful for that one.
Oh, man.
Especially this week. It's tearing through here in the Midwest.
So you've given us a lot of most or best or et cetera, that those adjectives used. So what can you tell us? Is there a most influential person in your life?
Oh, sure. Sociologists will always say it's mom and dad, usually in that order. Separating from that, it would be my grandfather, Sanford Bradshaw Tucker. He was my Grandpa Clegg had died before I was born. I never met him. Knew my grandma, and she was wonderful. But my Grandpa Clegg, and he was sheriff of Oregon County, Missouri. And sometimes I would get to ride with him in his car, and he just took the green Chevy farm car, and it was bad. He didn't like driving the regular police, sheriff's car. Anyway, we'd go someplace and he'd maybe have to serve papers, and he'd shake his finger. Now you stay in this car and don't get out no matter what happens, and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Well, we were driving through this area, and there was a sawmill and a charcoal plant or factory or where they made charcoal. Now he said, "Now, boy, in the war, the Yankees burned all of this out." And we drove a few more miles, And pretty soon I turned to him. I said, Papa, why would a baseball team do something like that? Slammed on the brakes, son. And we drove into Alton and went to the diner and had a piece of pie. And he, explained the whole Civil War to my little elementary school brain.
Yes.
And that birthday was followed up with a sack of blue and gray plastic soldiers and the golden book of the Civil War with those wonderful pen and ink drawings of the battlefields and my thirst for history I trace back then. His influence on my character and who I am, and he was a storyteller and a funny guy. The ironic thing also is his nickname was Sant or True because he looked so much like Harry Truman.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And wore a hat like Harry Truman. And in profile, he looked like Harry Truman. So they called him True. And maybe subconsciously that planted it in my head. And then, as you mentioned, listening to your relatives, when I would hear my dad and uncle and my godfather, talking about the war, sure, I was hearing about history, but I was also hearing about the episodes in their lives when they were most alive.
Okay.
And doing something so significant. And I believe that those two things came together. That was the genesis for a thirst for history. Arthur Schlesinger said, history is to a nation what memory is to an individual.
Sure.
And without our history, we're lost. And you can see things in society today where persons or forces are trying to eradicate aspects of our history just to silence it as we drift farther and farther away from any sense of absolute truths and core values to just emotions and rage and shame have replaced right and wrong. And Truman also said there's the only thing new in the world is the history you haven't learned. And being a student of history, there's a notion that we're condemned to relive our past. Well, there are patterns in history that, if we're not careful, do repeat themselves in culture after culture, generation after generation. And I think we look at some things today that are very disturbing to me. Yet at the same time, and I appreciate what you're doing, keeping the history alive, as well as the nostalgia for it and the affection for it. And I understand that we all have those kind of things. And underneath that is a rootedness to not a world that is gone, but a world that is maybe a little bit buried that needs to be unearthed in every one of us. And every generation talks about the good old days, and every generation talks about kids these days. They yelled at my brother about Elvis Presley, and they yelled at my parents about Glenn Miller, and yelled at their parents about whatever Foxtrot or something like that. Yelled at their every generation. That's normative.
Okay, that brings up a question then. Here you are with Elvis Presley. Well, actually, you weren't born yet, but when you when you started learning, becoming more aware of Elvis Presley and rock and roll music, what did your parents say to you about that? What was their attitude? Because all of a sudden, it seemed to me, in my reflection of music, was we went from a Glenn Miller type of culture to all of a sudden here's Elvis.
Yeah, four words. Four words is how my parents felt about it. Turn down that crap. Right? And what you're pointing to, I think sociologically, in the 50s, there's a shift. Up until then, every generation wanted to be like their parents.
Okay.
Really?
They dressed like them. Sure. Look at high school yearbooks up through about 1954. They look like younger versions. The girls look like younger versions of their moms. The boys looking, hair's done right and a tie, and the girls are, it. And then it changes. It changes to a youth-driven culture, which really explodes in the 60s. But what long hair is just an extension of the ducktail and the Brill cream and all that kind of stuff. And whether it was the greasy hair or the beach bum sort of thing, Beach Boys made popular, beach life. And at that point, the shift, though sociologically, is now youth identified with self or other youth rather than parents. And I think underneath that was a rejection of the norms and attitudes. Maybe we go back to church attendance, that kind of thing. The institutions in society, churches, synagogues, schools, begin to be marginalized,
questioned.
Yeah. And
why am I doing this?
Right. And questioned, but not answered adequately.
Yes.
It sort of, there was a gap. And as a result, we end up with a world that looks nothing like the generations before. Nothing like conspicuous consumerism, self-indulgent, self-gratifying, you look at magazine covers. In the 1930s comes out Time, and then Life, right? And then People, and then Us, and then Me. Right? It was what the freedom of individual freedom helped us weave together. The notion of individual freedom, which is the bedrock of where constitutional democracy came from. And it was, our form of government is designed for a self-governing people, right? That was the founders of the drafters of the Declaration and the Constitution, Bill of Rights. It was for a self-governing people. As those people become less self-governing, then externally the government has to govern them. And that's what we're seeing today. And in the 50s, there's a bit of an unraveling that just accelerates in the coming decades.
How did that start to unravel?
Well, I think conspicuous consumerism, just as one example. After World War,
tell us the definition of conspicuous consumerism.
Buying more than you need, accumulating. Up until then you may do, you fix things, but now it's just about the conspicuous consumption of more than you need.
Yes.
There's a particular institution that measures human beings. It's the military and the prison system. They measure how lean or heavy we are. In World War I, the average tunic was a 34-inch chest, 1918, right? In World War II, it actually goes down to a 32. That's the effects of the depression, right? And malnutrition, right? In Korea, this is just 5 years later, it goes to a 38. In Vietnam, it's a 42. In today, we're having difficulty meeting our recruitment needs in our U.S. military because recruits are unable to pass the physical tests. It's something about the 50s. What happened in the 1950s, on or around 1955, is the heavy introduction of high sucrose corn syrup into the American diet, right? And consuming of far more calories than we burn. That's an example of conspicuous consumerism, which is all a result of a generation that lived through a global depression and a world war.
Yeah.
Right. And they came home and GI Bill, and they were able to go to school and buy houses and have money, and absolutely determined to give their children what they didn't have. In their youth, and to make sure their children never suffered or faced the hardships that they did in the Depression and the war. And so they were generally shown love by being given things. And so love is associated with things. And so if I love myself, I give myself things. And
food. Love is associated with food.
The blessing becomes a curse, which is a theme woven through all of ancient literature, all through scripture, all through that just happens. And that's just one example of where the benefit becomes the downfall.
Yes.
And the result of individual freedom, right? But it's to govern myself, and then together we can be a force for good in the world. But now it's just becoming a world where when it's just about me, that individual freedom then becomes an idol rather than a blessing. And that's another trait in human beings. We tend to worship the blessing rather than the blessor. And
going back to the okay, here
am I answering your questions, or am I just talking at them?
Yes, you did. But it brought up another question. But okay, so we talk about the really abrupt. It was gradual, but it was abrupt change of culture in the 50s. And so you had the generation of our parents who lived through World War II, who bought only what was necessary, who scrimped and saved. Maybe they kept the money under the mattress, maybe not, so that because they didn't trust the banks. I don't know, that could have been earlier in the century. And then you had their children who were starting to want to be more individualized and have more self-freedom. What do you think it was like in the home atmosphere? In many of those homes in America in the 50s, what was there strife because of this turmoil between the generations?
Well, again, I think that's not unique to the 50s. I think that happens all along. But in the 50s, I believe it was revealed. I think the economic opportunities, and also you have the beginning of the change of the family unit. You have steadily increasing the latter half of the 50s into the 60s and really peaking in the 80s, the rate of divorce amongst Americans. So a lot of these things are interconnected. Individualism is a good thing, but when a good thing becomes everything, it becomes the worst thing. So I don't know if these began in the 50s as much as they were really revealed in us. Just like hardship revealed the greatness, the greatest generation, right? World War II generation, the great forged in hardship, in the Depression, forged, right? But forged in ease. What gets forged in ease is selfishness, because you want to slack that need, and it's only more. And I'm not saying I'm not saying let's go back to a depression or a global conflict, but I am saying that the only thing that can stand up to magnificent blessing is humility and great character.
In the 80s, there was, at least in rural America, there were many, because of high interest rates and other things that added to it, many farmers had to change occupations because they couldn't make it anymore.
Yep, the farm crisis.
Was that kind of a retro to the 50s, or the 30s, but maybe not? A gentler retro back to the time when you had to learn how to live with what you had rather than be self-consuming.
Well, yeah, there's, economic theorists will argue that it was the fallout of the New Deal. It was a fallout of, it was just unsustainable economically to keep funding everybody's practice. So the interest rates crept up and the tax crept up. And it's never one leap. It's the creep up. It wasn't just the tax on tea in 1774 when there were 7 taxes that led to the unrest at the beginning of our country, but hardship, right? The only way you develop resiliency as a human being is to go through hard things, or to learn from those who did. That's why your program is so valuable. And adults don't want to be taught anything they don't want to learn.
Neither do some children.
And exactly, human beings don't, and
right.
we don't change without the presence. The first thing that must ignite change is pain and discomfort. When the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the perceived pain of changing, human beings will not change until that moment. And trauma, many times, or crisis, will
Those are
result.
valuable words for everyone to.
Oh, yeah, I mean, we saw in a microcosm, 9/11, and what happened. And there was a brief, wonderful uniting of us as a people.
Yes. All those flags that were put on the cars and stuck out from the top of the door, what happened to them?
And that's normal. Yeah, what did happen to them? We have tremendous challenges today. There were tremendous challenges in June of 1950, and North Korea invades the South. There were tremendous the bomb. I wouldn't want to be alive any other time than right now.
Yeah. Tell me, I know this is kind of going back, and we talked about it with the rock and roll and then the change of hairstyles. And I know you weren't really probably affected as much by this until maybe the mid to the end 60s. Did you ever have long hair?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yes. And one of my failed careers was as a rock and roll musician.
Oh.
All right.
At one time, if I looked up, I could tuck it in my belt. Yeah, I mean, it was long.
You're kidding.
No, it looked like Beauty and the Beast. It was horrible. It was just like a big mangy thing. But
what I think is so interesting is you look at long hair on men now and compare it to what we thought was long hair on the Beatles. Holy smoke. There's no comparison.
Yeah. Nope. These kids these days, and that's how we've always been.
Yes.
And the expression of style, you go back to the Roman era, generations did that. They would affect a new fashion. And now today with consumerism, fashion is they just create something, an artificial need. They change the look, so you've got to buy it. What's in style, because that's out of style. So buy classics. They never go out of style.
How about the jeans with holes in them? We've had, back in the 50s, and we've had one guest talk about this, that was, my goodness, if we went out the door with holes in our jeans, what would the neighbors say? They'll say, Jack in your door evidently don't have enough money to buy jeans for their girls.
Back to that failed music career, was in Paris in the early 80s. And a gal who was part of the group bought a pair of high fashion, high dollar jeans that had holes in them. And she mailed them home. Her grandmother fixed them.
And what was her?
You ruined them.
What was her? Oh, that was her response. Yes, but would she have felt comfortable in that era? Would she have felt comfortable wearing those, or she was going to just be do her own unique thing?
In the 80s, well, fashion, kind of the fashionistas, that's Paris is like, Paris and Rome are like the
I know
high fashion. So.
The United States. Would she have felt comfortable wearing them?
She bought them. Paid a little bit of money for them, so I don't know if I can answer for her, but I think it would make me look different. That's part of the individualism thing. Yet at the same time, you ever notice when we're doing our own thing, we're not rebelling, we're conforming. We're looking like everybody else doing their own thing.
Yes.
I grew my hair out to rebel, so I could look like that guy.
And how'd your parents
drove my Volkswagen minivan out to Boulder, Colorado to find myself along with everybody else finding themselves in their Volkswagen minivan.
Do you think your
I'm sorry?
Do you think your parents thought
Okay.
Did I find myself? Well, yeah. I guess so. Fortunately, I never attempted the chemicals or thought that was the pathway to finding your.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. How did your parents just kind of step back and say, he's got to go through this, and we raised him right. He's going to be a nice boy after all.
Oh yeah, I never doubted that my parents loved me. Never. That was always rock solid. My dad and I were pretty cold and distant, and then his life was really changed when he was 87 years old, and we became best of friends. And I laid him to rest in July of 2020, 2 days short of 102.
Oh
Mhm.
my.
Today, my mother's 96, and I just had to put new tires on her car. She's,
Yeah.
you know, she worked until she was 90.
Ah,
Force of nature, and
mhm.
How great. How
So,
great that you have her to as a
Mhm.
as a resource in your heritage.
yeah, and that's really why I live here. Our folks were from Des Moines. I said I'd never come back here in my life. Was living out on the East Coast, and yet here I am,
yeah, that
center of the
happens.
known universe. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm.
Now,
Jackie, do
who's
you
from Washington? I saw one of you is in Washington State. Am I right?
I'm in the state of Washington right now,
Right.
in Janine, Iowa.
Yeah, I'm in Southwest Iowa at
Okay.
Atlantic.
Here we are. Right.
Yes.
And was it Colville?
Colville, yes. It
Colville?
looks like
I've never
Colville.
been there, but I have been. That's near Kettle Falls, isn't it?
It's like 8 miles away.
Okay. I know I've been there. So
You've been to Kettle Falls?
I have.
Wow.
I doing what I do, I travel all the time. So
Uh-huh.
just-
Did you happen to speak in any of the libraries here while you were here?
no. I think I did some consulting work. They may have rented a conference room at a library for them
In Colville.
in Colville. In Kettle Falls, I think. Or maybe it was Colville. I can't.
We can talk about that
Another time.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
Right
Jack-
now we want.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Jackie, do you want? We have time for about one more question.
Oh, we do?
Yeah, I
Oh,
know it's going quickly.
Okay. Well, let's see. How about the most important lesson in your life, and how did that come about? Just a Cliff Note version, please.
Yeah. Well, I think a theme. Most important pearl of wisdom. Somebody was quoting somebody from, almost 3,000 years ago, the monarch of Israel and Judah, King Solomon, who said, trust in the Lord with all of your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight.
Yes.
The path to greatness is humility, and
Yes.
Real greatness is found in submission and in trust and obedience, and having a foundation on that which is unshakably true. And that's, I suppose, the most important lesson I learned is that's for me and everyone else. And when, that if we would return there as a people, because I think, the theme of our conversation, we're at a crossroads as a society, and one road leads to social anarchy, the other leads to spiritual awakening, and I don't think there's a third way. In history, though, there have been these awakenings that have occurred that have overcome far worse social condition than we're facing now. Far worse. Far worse. Yeah, the antebellum era, 1840s and 50s, before the Civil War, Britain, Roman Empire, and on and on and on. It's gone.
And you can go way back to the Old Testament.
That's right.
There. So this is a very good way to end our fun chat with you. We really appreciate you taking time, and thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. You can sum up the Old Testament in one word: remember. And I think that's what you're doing on your show. So keep up the good work. It's been a joy to be with you.
Thank you
so much.
So, viewers, I have a couple of things I want to leave you with, and that is, please check the subscribe button and the thumbs up button. And until next time, tell your friends, your relatives about the 1950s Fun Chat. So